In 1907, a photograph was taken of the 5-man Norwegian Vintertann Expedition in the desolate Arctic. For over a century, it was seen as a tragic but ordinary historical record. But when a modern archivist digitized the image, he discovered a 6th figure in the photo. One that defied the laws of physics, leaving no footprints and casting no shadow. Dr. Aris Thorne was a meticulous historical archivist at the Bergen Maritime Institute. His job was simple, but important. He preserved pieces of history by creating digital copies of old photographs and documents. Most days, his work was routine and predictable. He would scan old images, check their quality, and file them away in digital archives. It was quiet work that he genuinely enjoyed, finding meaning in preserving the past for future generations. The photograph that would change everything arrived on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. It was a glass plate negative from 1907 showing 5 men standing in the Arctic wilderness. The men looked weathered and tired, but there was unmistakable pride in their weathered faces. They stood before a vast expanse of ice and snow that stretched beyond the frame into infinity. Their equipment was primitive by modern standards, consisting of wooden sleds, canvas tents, and basic navigation tools. Their expressions were grim but determined, showing the resilience that characterized polar explorers of that era. This was a record of the Vintertann Expedition, a historically noted but ultimately failed attempt to map a remote sector of the Arctic Circle. The official story was well known among historians and maritime researchers. The expedition had been defeated by unusually harsh weather conditions and rapidly dwindling supplies. It was a common and tragic fate for explorers of that dangerous era. Many brave men had ventured into the frozen wilderness with high hopes, only to be claimed by the merciless ice and unforgiving cold. Dr. Thorne's task was entirely routine. He needed to create a high-resolution digital copy of the photograph for the Institute's expanding online archive. It was one of thousands of similar images he handled each year. Nothing about this particular assignment seemed special, unusual, or worthy of extra attention. As the digitization process began, Dr. Thorne watched the high-resolution scan slowly appear on his computer monitor. He zoomed in methodically to check the image quality and focus. The details were remarkably clear for such an old photograph. He could see individual frost crystals on the men's beards and the worn texture of their heavy woolen coats. Then his eyes caught something unexpected behind the explorers, near a jagged ridge of ice. It was a 6th figure, standing slightly apart from the main group. At first, he dismissed it as a rock formation or a simple trick of the light. Old photographs often contained shadows and unusual shapes that resembled things they were not. But as he adjusted the contrast and brightness settings, details became impossible to ignore or explain away. The shape had the distinct and unmistakable silhouette of a human person. It was tall and slender, dressed in dark, simple clothing that seemed completely inadequate for the crushing Arctic cold. The figure stood perfectly motionless, as if deliberately posing for the camera alongside the official expedition members. The true anomaly became apparent when Dr. Thorne examined the surrounding area more carefully. The 5 explorers had left deep, clear tracks in the pristine snow. Their heavy boots had sunk into the white surface, creating distinct impressions that told the story of their movement across the frozen landscape. The ground around the 6th figure was completely untouched and unmarked. There were no footprints leading to or from its position. The snow beneath it was as smooth and pristine as if no living thing had ever been there. Even more disturbing was what Dr. Thorne noticed about the shadows cast by the afternoon sun. The low Arctic sun cast long, sharp shadows from the 5 men and all their equipment. Every object in the photograph had a corresponding dark shape stretching across the ice. The 6th figure cast no shadow at all. It appeared to have no physical substance, no interaction with the light that illuminated everything else in the scene. Dr. Thorne's first instinct was to find a completely rational explanation. He assumed it must be a common photographic artifact from that primitive era. Perhaps it was a double exposure, where 2 separate images had been accidentally combined on the same glass plate. Maybe it was a chemical smudge, a scratch, or some other flaw in the complicated photographic process of 1907. He decided to consult the Institute's forensic imaging expert. Dr. Sarah Chen had years of specialized experience analyzing historical photographs and identifying technical problems. If anyone could provide a reasonable explanation for what he was seeing, it would be her. Dr. Chen ran comprehensive diagnostic tests on the digital scan. She examined the image pixel by pixel, looking for any signs of manipulation, damage, or error. She checked for chemical stains, scratches on the original glass plate, and digital artifacts from the scanning process. Her sophisticated equipment could detect the smallest flaws or inconsistencies in photographic materials. Her conclusion was deeply unsettling and completely unexpected. The figure was not an artifact of any kind. It was a part of the original light exposure captured when the camera shutter was pressed in 1907. The same photons that formed the images of the 5 explorers had also formed the image of the 6th figure. Technically speaking, it had been physically present when the photograph was taken. Physically speaking, this seemed completely impossible. Now obsessed with solving the growing mystery, Dr. Thorne delved deep into the official archives of the Vintertann Expedition. He pulled every document, report, and record he could find related to the mission. He read the ship's manifest and the expedition roster carefully and repeatedly. 5 names were clearly listed. Only 5 men had been officially assigned to the dangerous expedition. He examined the official expedition log, written in careful detail by the captain, Henrik Dahl. The entries were professional and factual, methodically detailing daily temperatures, ice thickness measurements, and regular reports on crew morale and physical condition. Captain Dahl wrote in the precise, unemotional style typical of experienced naval officers. However, Dr. Thorne noticed a sudden and dramatic shift in tone during the final week before the photograph was dated. The neat, organized entries became short, erratic, and increasingly paranoid in nature. Captain Dahl began mentioning strange occurrences and unusual experiences that seemed completely out of character for such a practical and level-headed man. The captain wrote extensively about persistent, shared nightmares among all the crew members. He described a constant, overwhelming feeling of being watched, even when they were completely alone on the endless ice. The men had become jumpy, suspicious, and nervous, constantly looking over their shoulders at the empty landscape around them. The final entry in the official log was particularly disturbing and haunting. It consisted of only one line, written in shaky handwriting that barely resembled Captain Dahl's usual neat and precise script. It simply read, "God forgive us. Lars is gone. The expedition's over." Dr. Thorne strongly suspected there had been a deliberate and systematic cover-up. He began searching extensively for unofficial records that might tell the real story of what happened to the Vintertann expedition. After several days of digging through dusty archives and forgotten storage rooms, he made a remarkable and unexpected discovery. Captain Dahl's personal effects had been carefully sealed by his family after his death and donated to the Institute decades earlier. The donation came with a very specific and unusual condition. The sealed crate was to remain completely unopened for exactly 100 years. That century had recently passed, making the contents legally accessible for the first time since Dahl's death. Dr. Thorne obtained special permission from the Institute's board of directors to open the long sealed crate. Inside, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, he found a small leather-bound journal. Its yellowed pages were filled with Captain Dahl's personal handwriting, telling a story dramatically different from the sanitized official expedition log. The journal revealed the true horror of what the crew had experienced during their final weeks on the ice. According to Dahl's private and honest account, the nightmare began several weeks into their complete isolation. The crew started seeing a silent, mysterious figure at the edge of their vision, constantly watching them from distant ice ridges and snow formations. The figure never approached their camp or made any attempt at contact. It never made a sound or gave any sign of being truly alive. But it was always there, a dark and ominous silhouette against the endless white landscape. The men began calling it Ismannen, the Iceman in their native Norwegian language. Most disturbing and inexplicable of all was the complete absence of any tracks or traces. Whenever the crew investigated the specific places where they had seen the figure standing, they found absolutely nothing. No footprints, no disturbance in the snow, no evidence that anything physical had ever been there. The crew's mental state deteriorated rapidly under the constant psychological pressure of being observed. They became increasingly paranoid and suspicious of each other. Some men refused to leave the relative safety of the camp alone. Others became convinced they were collectively losing their minds. One crew member, a young and enthusiastic man named Lars, developed a very different and disturbing reaction to the mysterious presence. While the others were gripped by growing fear and anxiety, Lars became genuinely fascinated by the enigmatic figure. He began talking about it as if it were a friend, referring to the Iceman as a benevolent spirit of the Arctic that had come to guide and protect them. On the day the photograph was taken, Captain Dahl made a desperate decision born of desperation. The crew's morale had collapsed completely, and he feared they might not survive much longer in their current deteriorating mental state. He decided to stage a formal photograph with the Norwegian flag, hoping to restore some sense of purpose, national pride, and unity among his men. As the 5 men gathered solemnly for the photograph, they saw the Ismannen standing directly behind them. For the first time since the encounters began, the figure had approached close enough to be clearly visible to all of them simultaneously. It stood motionless, as if it fully intended to be included in the formal portrait. Captain Dahl's journal described the terrifying moment in vivid and haunting detail. The crew was completely paralyzed with overwhelming fear, unable to move, speak, or even breathe normally. In a moment of pure panic and disbelief, Dahl frantically set the camera's timer and rushed to join his men. The photograph was taken accidentally, capturing what may have been the only visual evidence of the entity they had been seeing for weeks. The journal's final entries described in disturbing detail what happened immediately after the photograph was taken. The mysterious figure simply vanished without warning, disappearing as suddenly and silently as it had first appeared. But the ordeal was far from over. Lars, who had been smiling peacefully throughout the entire supernatural encounter, calmly announced that he was finally going home. Before anyone could react or stop him, he turned and walked purposefully away into the surrounding blizzard. He moved with complete confidence and determination, as if he knew exactly where he was going and what awaited him. The remaining crew members were too shocked and terrified to follow him into the storm. They watched helplessly as Lars disappeared completely into the white wilderness. He left no trail that they could follow, and despite their desperate calls, he never looked back or acknowledged them. The expedition collapsed immediately and completely. The survivors hastily packed their essential equipment and began the long, dangerous journey back to civilization. They made a solemn pact never to speak of what they had witnessed in the Arctic. The official story blamed severe weather and critical supply problems for their early return. Dr. Thorne now understood the complete truth behind the mysterious photograph. It was not a hoax, trick, or technical error. It was the only existing evidence of an inexplicable encounter in the Arctic wilderness. The official story of weather-related failure had been a carefully constructed lie, created by traumatized survivors who knew no one would believe the impossible reality. He prepared a comprehensive presentation for the Institute's board of directors. He included the enhanced photograph, detailed scientific analysis from the forensic expert, and carefully transcribed passages from Captain Dahl's hidden journal. He expected his colleagues to be amazed by the historical significance of his discovery. Instead, he was met with cold resistance and outright hostility. The board members absolutely refused to acknowledge his findings or consider their implications. They argued that publishing such extraordinary claims would damage the Institute's reputation and expose them to academic ridicule. They ordered him to immediately reseal the journal and delete all enhanced digital files. Dr. Thorne realized that his discovery would be buried forever if he followed their orders. The truth about the Vintertann Expedition would die with him, just as it had nearly died with the original survivors over a century ago. Facing the complete erasure of his work, Dr. Thorne made a difficult but necessary choice. He secretly copied the high-resolution photograph, his detailed analysis, and key pages from Captain Dahl's journal. He uploaded everything to several online forums dedicated to historical mysteries and unexplained phenomena. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The photograph of the Vintertann Expedition spread rapidly across the internet, shared and discussed by thousands of people around the world. It was no longer just a simple historical artifact. It had become a viral enigma, a piece of documented evidence that challenged conventional understanding. The Bergen Maritime Institute officially denied Dr. Thorne's claims and completely disavowed his work. They released statements calling his analysis flawed and his conclusions unscientific. But the evidence was now beyond their control, freely available for anyone to examine and judge. The photograph serves as a chilling reminder that history contains mysteries that may never be fully explained. Sometimes cameras capture things that were never meant to be seen by human eyes. The Esmanen was documented only once, in a single accidental photograph taken over a century ago. What the entity was, where it came from, and whether it still waits in the desolate Arctic ice remains completely unknown. The 5 survivors of the Vintertann Expedition took most of their secrets to their graves. Only the photograph remains, forever frozen in time, showing 6 figures where there should have been only 5.